Stragglers will be coming in. It's very difficult to encourage people to leave these long and elegant coffee breaks. But I do encourage you all, since we do have these long periods of time, the museum is open, the galleries are open to visit, so you can go into the galleries during the coffee breaks. You don't have to be standing by the pastries all the time. For those of you, do remember that the museum is closed on Tuesdays. So for those speakers and fellows who will be doing our excursions, we're not going to be able to visit the museum you're not going to be able to visit the museum on Tuesday. So do take advantage of the time that's available. It's open until 5 today, did you say? 5:30 today. So. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next VCU student, to introduce our third speaker of the morning, Hugh Kennedy.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sharifa Darwish, a senior art history major in VCU, Qatar. Dear honored guests, professors, fellow students, ladies and gentlemen. Our next speaker is a graduate of Cambridge University. Dr. Hugh Kennedy is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, a fellow of the British Academy, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy of Science and Letters. He is the author of 10 books, including The Court of the Caliphs of 2004 and The Great Arab Conquest of 2007. He is specialist in the early Islamic Middle East, Muslim Spain, and the Crusades. He was a professor in the Middle Eastern history at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland until 2007. Since that time, he has been a professor of Arabic at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. I'm personally looking forward to hearing his views on the Abbasid economy of the Islamic Golden Age. His presentation is entitled Baghdad as a Center of Learning and Book Production. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Hugh Kennedy.
Thank you, Sharifa, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. And I want to add my thanks, of course, to the organisers of this conference, particularly to Jonathan Sheila, for inviting me to be here. And inviting me to be here under something of false pretences, because I'm not an art historian, and I have no fancy pictures to offer you. I am rather a historian of the economy and society of the early Islamic Middle East. My current project is looking at the development and integration of the, shall we say, the mature Islamic economy of the period from the early Abbasid period right through to the coming of the Seljuks in the 11th century, and trying to draw together both the material and the literary evidence, which will enable us to look at the size, the scope, the technologies, the interactions of this period of the economy. And my colleague Fanny Bassar and myself are putting on a series of seminars in London to try to draw together scholars from different areas to look at this point of view. So what I'm coming to you with today, I'm speaking a bit slowly because there are all sorts of people still coming in at the back, and maybe I'll just pause for a moment while people take their chairs. It's amazing, isn't it? Until you start talking, nobody leaves the coffee room. It's the only way of persuading people to come in. Right. So what I'm going to give you today is a social and economic historian's appreciation of, I think, a fundamental, not a problem, a fundamental fact of this period. Why does Baghdad become such an enormous centre of book production, and not just of literature, to be sure, but also physical production of books. And I want to suggest to you that what goes on in Baghdad during the period that I'm going to be looking at, which is roughly from obviously the foundation of the city in 762, and I'll use common era dates throughout just for simplicity. The foundation of the city in 762, right through to the coming of the Seljuks in 1050. And I want to suggest that what went on in Baghdad in those centuries was something very exceptional, and we should be, if we want to understand it, if we want to understand the impact of it, we should be looking at the origins of this movement. And how do we know? Why do we think that the amount of literary production and so on is so exceptional? Well, we read the books. And we start off by reading the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, writing in around 988. Ibn al-Nadim's Fihrist, the word, of course, in modern Arabic just means an index, but it is a catalogue. People did wonder whether it's a bookseller's catalogue or a library catalogue or whatever it is, of all the books that Ibn al-Nadim knew about in Baghdad at this stage. And we see the immense quantity of literary production and the immense variety. Let me just read out, just to give you some idea of this, the various chapter headings. And the number of pages that are devoted to these various sections in the published edition. He starts off with the languages and scripts of the Muslims and other people of the book, 35 published pages. Grammar and lexicography, of course, very important central part of the whole literary enterprise, runs to 51 pages. History, akhbar, and belles lettres, adab, biography, siyar, and so on, run to 73 pages. Poetry, surprisingly short, only 22 pages. Scholastic theology, kalam, 47 pages. Law and tradition, fiqh and hadith, 38 pages. Falsafa, philosophy and the ancient sciences, 62 pages. Stories, legends and romances, 17 pages. Then, peculiarly, but very interestingly, the doctrines of non-monotheistic creeds go to 32 pages, and you finish off with alchemy at 9 pages. These, remember, are just the lists of the authors and the titles of the books that are produced. And it, as I say, it is revealing not just of the quantity, but also the scope of this literary activity. Again, consider the records that are compiled and developed of the life of Prophet Muhammad during this period. The life of Prophet Muhammad in Ibn Ishaq, in the English translation of Ibn Ishaq's life, amounts to some 300,000 words. The Gospel of St. Matthew, which is the longest and most sustained of the Gospels that tell us of the life of Christ, have 30,000 words. We can see we're talking about a different realm. And consider, too, Tabari's great History of the Prophets and Kings, text on which I spent the last 50 years working on and off, but mostly on. Tabari's History of the Prophets and Kings in the English translation runs to 38 printed volumes. Each of these printed volumes is more than 250 pages long. We are talking about a truly astonishing level and variety and sustainability of the literary production of this period in Baghdad. And we can contrast it just for a second with the scale of literary production in Western Europe at any time really up until the 16th century. There is nothing like this scale of writing and reproduction of books that we're getting in Baghdad during this period. Now, why should this be? Why is it that Baghdad has this exceptional status, and Baghdad and some of the surroundings here, we can include Basra and so on, but fundamentally Baghdad is where the action was. And I believe to understand this, we need to look back into the circumstances of the early Islamic conquests of this area. And in particular, not the military conquests, but the administrative arrangements that were made in the immediate aftermath of the conquests. Now, historians have disputed about this, the reality of the tradition that we are fed, as it were, by the Muslim sources. and people have doubted the historical reality of all sorts of things that we read. But I myself have become increasingly, as I go on reading this stuff, increasingly fundamentalist in the sense of accepting that the early Islamic sources are painting in their own way and for their own reasons, but they're painting a vision of a reality that we can actually, as it were, touch and feel. And recent developments, for example, in the study of Egyptian papyri and the revelation that we have very, very early texts in Arabic dating from the few years after the conquest itself, it has produced more evidence, more support for this general point of view. And what we are told in Baladri and Tabari particularly is the way in which the second caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, in the aftermath of the conquest, obliged the Arab Muslim conquerors to settle not throughout the landscape, not wherever they wanted to go, but in the Amsar, in the cities, particularly the great cities of Basra and Kufa. And I believe that this decision had a fundamental effect, much more widely than you might imagine, on the development of Muslim culture. A Misr, incidentally, I'm convinced, a Misr is a subset of cities. It's a subset of Mudun. A Misr is a city where taxes are collected, where a diwan is kept, and where people are paid. That's what makes it different from other Mudun, from other cities. And the fundamentals of this system were the collection of taxes, variously called Kharaj and Jizya, and I don't want to get into all the complications of that at the moment, and the payment of, we call them salaries, call them pensions. There's quite an important distinction, but again, I haven't really got time to get into that. But the collection of the ata, the registering of those who were the collection of taxes, the registration of those who are entitled to payments in diwans, and the payment of the taxes. And these payments were made in cash money. And that's a very important thing for all sorts of reasons. We hear about ata as a cash money, we hear about rizq as payments in kind in the very earliest stages of the Muslim administration. We can see that operating, for example, in the Nasana Papyri, where we're told that amounts of oil and so on are transferred to the Arab population. By the Abbasid period, rizq always means a cash payment. It's lost its sense of being a payment in kind. So lots and lots of people, Baladri in the Ansab al-Ashraf gives us some of the figures for these, 60,000 in Kufa, 80,000 in Basra. People are being paid cash salaries on a regular basis. And this meant that the Islamic world was the only area of the post-late antique world that maintained a system of public taxation. And public taxation may sound the most boring thing in the entire world, but in fact public taxation is very important for deciding on state structures. Nowhere else, not in Western Europe in any area, not even in the Byzantine world of the time, was public taxation maintained in the same way that it was in the Islamic world. And it was maintained for the specifically, if you like, Islamic purpose of paying the Muqatala, the Arab fighters and so on who are settled in these cities, i.e. the maintenance of public taxation responds to a need. It isn't just something you pick up because it's already there. It responds to a need in the early Islamic state, and that is why it's developed, and that is why it survives. And we were just hearing, of course, from Robert in the first paper, of course, about Abdul Malik and the way in which Abdul Malik's decision to make the Arabic the language of administration in all the areas of the caliphate has a profound effect. Arabic becomes, as he was showing to us, a public language on coinage, a public language on monumental inscriptions, a public language on milestones that are put up along the roads in Syria and Palestine during this period. I think this is an interesting debate that we should just bear in mind. It's because of state activity of this sort that Arabic does not remain just a language of religion and the discussion of faith. That Arabic moves out, as it were, from the religious sphere into every aspect of everyday life. And this is an extraordinary development which need not necessarily have happened. I mean, there's human agency involved in this, in making decisions which have long-term effects. One could imagine a situation in which Arabic remained the language, of course, of Quran and the language of religious discourse, but like Latin in later medieval Europe, it gradually retreated to the academy and the Bible, and the rest of the administration was carried on in various sort of vernaculars. Abdul Malik's decision made sure this was not going to be the case. And therefore, we get the prevalence of the administration needs Arabic. It's also worth reflecting, of course, the administration needs Arabic to keep the records in now. It also needs more effective ways of recording numbers, because the accounts were kept in huge detail, and particularly land was measured. The masraha of the land necessitated a really quite high degree of competence in mathematics on the parts of administrators. And this is why the Islamic world during this period is so receptive to the introduction of what were originally Indian numerals and what we call Arabic numerals. They were adopted in Baghdad, in administration and in the society of Baghdad, because they were useful to that society. If you've ever imagined the concept of multiplying in Roman numerals just for a second, you will realize why Arabic numerals are so much vastly better. But there again, things are only adopted when a society needs them and wants to make use of them. It's because there was demand for this sort of technology, this new sort of technology in the world of Baghdad, that these things become prevalent. And so, Arabic literacy becomes a passport to all sorts of careers. People learn Arabic because you get better, proper Arabic because you get good jobs when you do it. People don't learn Greek anymore, and they don't learn Pahlavi anymore by the 8th century, because there are no jobs in Greek and Pahlavi anymore. That if you want to make it as a career, almost anybody except for a soldier, I'll come back in a minute, then you need to know Arabic. So what can we say? Can we say anything about rates of literacy in this society? And of course, the first thing is it's impossible to know. We have no statistics. But a high level of literacy, and I'll try in the end to put some figures on, but a high level of literacy seems to be assumed by a whole lot of the discourse that we find from this period. It is accepted that it is normal for people to be able to read and write. As far as I can tell, all the Abbasid caliphs could read and write, just from records of their doings and things. And that was taken for granted. It wasn't commented on whatsoever. The only one that is commented on is the warrior caliph Mu'tasim, of whom it was said that his reading and writing wasn't really very good. But this is taken as an exception. It was because he was unusual in this respect. And it's worth remembering, perhaps, that the first English king who is known to have been able to read and write with any fluency was King Edward I in the late 13th century. And so, whereas in the early Abbasid period, and I suspect in the Umayyad period too, but I haven't looked through enough of the record, the reading and writing absolutely considered as the norm for the elite. And we have all sorts of non-elite indications in works like Kitab al-Aghani. Kitab al-Aghani of al-Asfahani is a wonderful work for the studying of these sorts of things, because it's only in the lives of the poets, really, that you get non-elite upbringings recorded in any detail, because lots of the poets came socially from nowhere, and they made their money, by their talents and so on. So we get records of how these people started off, and I'm just remembering the example of the biography of Ibrahim al-Mawsili, the first of the Mawsilis, who are great poetic figures and literary entrepreneurs, so to speak, impresarios in the history of Baghdad, and how he starts off by going to a Kutub school in Basra and learning his letters, despite the fact that he comes from really a family of displaced Iranian refugees, basically, who've come down to Basra. And we know about this because while he was at elementary school, some of his fellow pupils belonged to one of those important Abbasid families that controlled the administration and so on. And they gave him a leg up because they'd been at primary school with him. And the whole thing, the point of this is not to say that everyone went to primary school and learnt their letters. The point of this is to suggest that it was considered quite normal that people of different social classes and so on should intermingle at this level of acquiring basic literacy. What else, other straws in the wind, can we use for this? Well, in the early 10th century, relations between the Sunnis and Shi'is in Baghdad became very bitter and frequently violent. And the main way, or one of the main ways in which this warfare was carried on by other means, was by writing slogans on street walls. And above all, the public cursing of people. And the public cursing of Muawiyah was the key issue here. Because your attitude to Muawiyah was curiously very indicative of, more indicative than, because everyone, or lots of people, thought the Rashidun were great caliphs, but Muawiyah is much more a test case, if you like. And people were killed in quite large numbers because of slogans written on the walls cursing Muawiyah. Now, this only works if lots of people can read it, or at least a sufficient number of people can read what was no doubt quite crude and vigorous Arabic. But again, it suggests that we're working in a society where literacy is taken for granted. We find out a little bit more in that most wonderful of 10th century historical texts, Bayhaqi's Tariq-i Masudi, which was Persian text, which has recently been wonderfully translated into English by the late and much lamented Edmund Bosworth. So it's accessible to those of us whose Persian is not as good as it ought to be. And he talks a lot about literacy at the Ghaznavid court. Who could read? Everyone who was important in the administration, including the author Bayhaqi himself, was totally literate in Arabic and Persian. Bila kayf, that was just taken for granted. The Amir himself was, we are told, of course, splendidly literate in Persian, but not in Arabic. And generally, people could read and write as a matter of course. The only people who couldn't read and write, this is quite interesting, was the Turkish soldiers. The commander of the Turkish army, when a document has to be signed, has to get somebody to sign it for him, because he can't read and write. So we work back as a caricature almost, isn't it? The people of the sword can't read and write. The administrators all can do it as a matter of course. These are the sorts of straws in the wind. These are the sort of indicative things that we can look at if we're trying to imagine rates of literacy. And I think probably if we were to assume that in the city of Baghdad, perhaps 20% of the adult male population of that city could read and write on a fairly sound basis, we might well be right. We might well be underestimating it. And I think this is a whole project that needs to be taken further and investigated further. Anyone looking for a PhD subject out there? You know, go for it. It'd be extremely interesting to pick up these straws in the wind from all the various sources and see what we can do with that. The second thing that is really crucial in this is the size of Baghdad, as it were. The gross population of Baghdad has been estimated really everything from 250,000 up to 1 million during this period, but people are probably settling now on the assumption that it was about 500,000 people living in Baghdad at the maximum extent of the settlement. And perhaps we should include the population of Samarra here as a sort of suburb of Baghdad, though it isn't really, but you know, an adjunct to this. And we must perhaps again contrast that with at the same time when London might have had a population of 10,000 and Paris might have had a population of 20,000, but probably didn't. We're talking in the Islamic Middle East of a vastly different scale of urbanization. Why should this be? Why do cities survive and grow during this period at a time when in Western Europe and indeed in the Byzantine Empire they are struggling to survive in any meaningful sense at all? And we come back, I think if we want to understand this, we come back to what I was talking about at the beginning, the circumstances of the settlement of the Arab Muslims in the cities in the years immediately after the conquest, and Baghdad becomes the greatest Misr of them all in the sense of a place where taxation is collected and people are paid. For the taxation system, creates a demand in the economy. And I think this is crucial to understanding why literature and book production appears on the scale that it does. There is a demand in this economy. It's a demand, firstly, for basically food and things to eat and drink, and the basic necessities of life. But the demand in the economy goes much further than that. By the time we're looking at the civilization of Baghdad in the 9th and 10th century, there is an enormous demand in the economy for things that show your status and distinction, things that you don't actually need to keep alive. And we see this in the, alas, almost entirely lost textile production, the loving descriptions of the elegant textiles that we find in the text. We find it in, for example, the ceramics. So beautiful examples upstairs that you'll see of luster work and metal work and so on from the Abbasid period. We see it in food, in the sort of gourmet culture that we find in at least some of the Abbasid literature. You want to make your meals distinguished. You want people to be telling stories about wonderful dinner parties you gave. You want things, exotic fruits from faraway places. You want elaborate and complicated ways of preparing it, which show that your cooks and your servants and so on are altogether excellent, and you're a person of general discrimination and elegance. And so it's a very consumerist society. And fortunately for us, and fortunately for the reputation of the society, it's books and literature is one of the things that you consume. One of the ways in which you distinguish yourself from the Amma, from everybody else, the lower classes, if you like. You assert your khasa status, in the vocabulary of the time, is by buying books, collecting a private library, paying translators to translate things from Greek into Arabic, which becomes a very fashionable part of court culture in the reign of Ma'mun and Mu'tasim and Wa'athiq and so on during this period. And so you get a culture where books are one of the most, and books and authors are one of the most desirable products of this, as I say, very consumerist culture here. And I know for people who love literature, it sounds a little as if I'm reducing it all to a rather basic level, but I think these things are important to understand when we're looking at that. And we get the state where it's said to be, on several occasions, there are more than 100 bookstalls in the Souk al-Warakin. And remember, authors made money by copying, writers made money by copying to order, as well as by selling books. But in order for this explosion of bookmaking activity to occur, certain technological changes had to come. And Jonathan will be talking this afternoon about the coming of paper, and I'm not going to go there, save to just acknowledge that Jonathan's book on paper before print was one of the things that really put me, started me thinking about this. But the other thing that changes, of course, is styles of writing. The development of a Naskhi hand that enables Arabic to be written much more quickly. We've looked this morning at these wonderful Kufic manuscripts and Hijazi manuscripts and so on, which are wonderful and beautiful things, but they have to be written quite slowly and quite carefully and so on. Whereas the sort of hands that were being developed, which we associate with the Vizier Ibn Muqla, particularly at the beginning of the 10th century in Baghdad, were much, much quicker. So writing becomes both cheaper in terms of writing material, and it becomes faster in terms of the different techniques of doing this sort of conducting this sort of activity. So I want to finish up by making the point that there is, in a sense, what happens in Baghdad during this is a sort of perfect storm of things coming together to enable this sort of vast expansion of bookmaking and book writing activity, which is so characteristic of it. The things that come together are the question of the technologies we've looked at, the question of the size of the population of Baghdad, which creates a a mass market, or the possibilities of a mass market. The question of literacy within that population, which again increases the demand. The question of a culture of consumerism, amongst which literature is and books are one of the desirable goods by which you determine your and show your status. And this culture is has been very vividly, I think, illustrated recently in Shaukat Turawa's book on Ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur, who is a literature of the 10th century, 9th century, excuse me. Now, lots of people thought Ibn Abi Tahir wasn't really very good. Snotty critics, sniffy critics, whatever the word is. Superior critics said that he misquoted his poetry, he didn't understand this and that and the other. But he wrote an awful lot. And he was a man who operated in what we can think of what used to be called in 19th century England a sort of Grub Street context, i.e. people churning out cheap and cheerful books for a market, rather than people writing very fine manuscripts for patrons and so on. And he managed to survive and make a living doing that. So I come perhaps to my conclusion here, is that Baghdad in the 9th and 10th century was perhaps the first place in the history of planet Earth where people could make a living as an author. Now, clearly, lots of people have written lots of stuff before this time, but almost inevitably they'd either been rich people themselves, and they were gentlemen scholars, or they were employed by rich patrons to to write the things, or they belong to institutions, Christian monasteries classically, but other institutions, even Mesopotamian temples, when we look back to the days of cuneiform tablets and so on, other institutions that meant that they didn't have to work for a living. I think in Baghdad, in this mass market and for books and so on, it was possible for a man like Ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur to make a living as an author in the way that lots of us struggle to do nowadays with more. It wasn't easy then, it's gone no easier now. but I think this is an important moment to just contemplate in world history. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm obliged to.